and I've got that phone silent, so it won't go
Okay.
off.
All right, I just
So I
silenced
think,
all my contraptions around here too.
well, yeah,
So,
we're all
yeah, yeah,
wired and fired.
yeah.
Lance, I have Lance Tollison with me here, and Lance worked at the Juvenile Detention Center in Cape 120 years ago, or
Seems like it. Seems like it. So 1987 was when I first started working juvenile detention in Cape as a full time person. So I started off in the early '80s as part time, went full time
while you were in
while I was
college.
in college,
Yeah.
and did a little stint while I was in college working the detention center lockup area, and went full time when I graduated in '86. I've kind of been in juvenile from '82 for a long time before I jumped over into the education field here.
The early 80s, it was about the only detention center for the south of Missouri on the southeast side.
Yeah,
So we're
we were
doing a
the
lot of contracts.
we were the holding facility contracts with several surrounding counties until another one was built, I think, in the Bloomfield area. So, we housed at that time, back in the early '80s, we housed probably 15 kids, maybe maximum. Because you can back in the old days you could even bunk. We had some bunk areas and stuff where you could sleep more at a room. So, yeah, I saw changes over the time from the early '80s, from the time I became the administrator of the facility in the mid '80s. So we stayed busy with a lot of different kids in surrounding counties.
So at some point you left Cape and went to San Antonio.
Yeah, I left Cape in the I guess the mid '80s, I guess, and then went to San Antonio, Texas, and worked at a juvenile detention facility in San Antonio, which was a 200 bed lockup facility, and so that was kind of an eye-opening thing for me as well. From Cape Girardeau, with it was not necessarily small, but it was a big to me at that time, and then going to San Antonio and working in that facility, and I was on the floor working the lockup facilities and those modules that they had there, which was a eye-opening experience for me as well.
Now, lockup, they would be sentenced there and stay there longer than.
It was kind of, kids were locked up long term. That each state, obviously has their own. In Missouri, it was a Division of Youth Services. In Texas, it was the Texas Youth Commission. What I did notice the difference in Texas and compared to Missouri was the length of stay in detention was a lot longer than the length of stay in Missouri. Texas Youth Commission, I think, was just overwhelmed, overbooked. When you're talking about the treatment phase of detention or of lockup, and the next step in the kids' mind and incarceration, and what the next step is, and DYS a little quicker getting kids involved in their programs, and in Texas it was a little bit longer, but in the city it was a long-term. I mean, it was a long-term lockup facility, and kids were basically still had to wait for court proceedings, but it definitely was a little bit longer, and crime was different too. It's what they perceived. Yeah, the crime rate was higher in San Antonio than it was in Cape, obviously, because you're going from a population of 30 to 50,000 surrounding, that the 32nd Circuit in Missouri took care of, to San Antonio, a city of 1.2 million, and in the center of the city was in Bexar County was the lockup facility, so it housed a lot of kids. But what I saw was, the crime was obviously the crime was in more serious nature. You saw more violent crime that came through and locked up in the facility. Whereas in Missouri, in our facility, the crime we would hold kids for 3 or 4 days for sometimes minor offenses, but they were held 3 or 4 days. In San Antonio, that wasn't the case. Those 3 or 4 days kids they didn't exist. It was processed and sent to the juvenile office, and then start with that either probation or out of office type intervention. So we didn't see a lot of I didn't see a lot of the petty shoplifters hanging out in the detention facility in San Antonio.
But when you came back to Cape, you brought a lot of programming, you brought a lot of policy ideas, and it was a good shot in the arm for our detention center. That it was like, well, where's the policy for this, or what are we going to do with this with the staff?
Yeah,
set up training. And
when I came back, it was the things I brought was what I learned, and I was fortunate enough to come back to be the administrator of the facility here in Cape, and so it was, from just the routine of checking kids in, and the process that the checking kids in, the check marks of things that you need to follow with the search. You're searching your juveniles, and then as far as the contact information and setting them up with things like that, and just the policies on the bed checks and the intervention that's involved for suicide watches and all those things. I felt that at the time I was instrumental in developing that. I mean, it was a team effort, but it was something that really needed to be seized and needed to be done. And I had some experience in doing that when that type of stuff was starting to take place here in the Cape Girardeau area, and that experience I got in San Antonio was beneficial to me.
Well, and I think those policies, after we pulled them all together, other facilities were asking us for our policies.
They were,
So
and
ours
we
were passed around
very
pretty often.
fortunate. We're very fortunate to have the surrounding people that that looked at that, and of course we at the time we went to enough meetings and enough input from other places on what we needed to work on and what we needed to do, and had some guidance. But ultimately, you always want to be the one that does something that people want to follow. That means you're doing it right. And I think with Cape, we felt like we were doing it right at the time. And I can remember a lot of instances and a lot of incidents that if we hadn't followed that, we would have probably been in some sort of situation, either negligence or whatever. And having those are a guide, but having those are also protection.
It doesn't keep you always out of the fire, though.
No, I don't think nothing really keeps you out of it. I think there's always a fire that you always got to try to put out. But your conscience is what's important, and understand that you felt like you've done things right and you've done things the way it's supposed to be done. And that's why you set those things up that way, is to not only protect, but to give you the ease of mind. And if there's something that can be done, you review after every incident whether something needs to be adjusted. And I think we're always on the look for a better way to do something that's going to benefit the facility, but also benefit the individual that's there.
Yeah, we were in Cape more so than others. We're very short term, which probably is why we were shut down, is we didn't hold enough kids, didn't hold long enough, and so when they looked around the state and closed 7 down, they looked at Cape and said, well, they might not need a detention center because of how many they hold there and how many just few days they held. But we're working another system now. We're doing the detention alternative, and we've gone from detaining between 400 kids a year down to 50 kids a year. So it's a little different system.
Yeah, I think that's the trends too. It's always the intervention and to get the individual and the juvenile on the right track and to solve their issues. And I know lockup's not solving issues, but I also look at that. There's 2 ways of looking at that. And when I've left that field back in the early '90s and had taken a different route professionally, but I stayed in touch with what was going on in the old juvenile office, and I was sad to know that was the case, because I looked at it as another thing. Our efficiency allowed us to get kids in and out of there quickly, and that was from the juvenile officer to the juvenile judge to the system with Division of Youth Services and all that stuff. And so in a sense, you're almost punished for efficiency. In my mind, that's the way I looked at it. We were very efficient. We moved them through, and we took it seriously to get those kids in and out of the facility and back into something that's going to be help solving their issues.
Well, that was why we were set up that way. And like you said, it burned us in the long run. But the new system, fairly efficient as long as you're passing the ball. As long as I keep everybody passing the ball and moving the kid around and making the contacts as fast as we can using our technology, it seems to be working okay, at least at this point. So during that career at the detention center, were there some cases or some kids that, when you think back, are the main points out of the water?
Well, there's a lot of instances that I always still think about sometimes, and I was administering, and also my assistant at the time. We had a suicide. That's always stands out with a young man that killed himself in the facility, and I always remember that. But that goes back to procedures and things in place, and we were doing the best we could, and really monitoring and documenting that individual, and it still happened, and those are things. But I also remember the things we had in place after the fact, for me as an administrator, for my assistant that helped that kind of desensitizing us and talking about and bringing in the counselor to visit with us, because of something we had to deal with professionally, and that's something that I always remember. And I think it's important to keep in place. I mean, sometimes you think workers are immune to some of those things, and they're really not. And so that case, and then you always remember the high profile ones when there's some serious ones from your kids, the gang kids that came in from Illinois one time and had us high speed chase through Jackson, and I got a nice awakening to the gang world in another state. When
Right.
those individuals came in, so those type of cases always kind of stand out. That give you an idea of kind of what's out there, out of your little circuit. Sometimes when you experience those things, so those stick out. But I also remember there's a lot of good people that went through that place working, are still working there today. So that's it's a nice been a nice facility and a nice job to get into, and those people care for kids, and that's what's important.
Nice jumping off place for a lot of staff.
It was for me, so
Mhm.
it gave me in the right direction. I went to school to be a teacher, but I didn't do it right away. I was working part time at juvenile office, liked it, felt I was helping. Went full time when I got out of school, and stayed in it till the mid-90s, and before I decided to use my degree. And so, but what I learned there and what I learned as an administrator of a detention facility prepared me to do what I'm doing today, and handling kids and dealing with kids as an administrator in the education field.
Mhm.
And so there's nothing you can always say I've seen about everything, and sometimes I think I have. There's always something that pops up, but I've seen a lot, and I've seen a lot of stuff over the 20, 30 some years that I've been associated with kids.
I've heard over and over with people like you that've jumped fields, that having that base of working with at-risk kids and being thrown into the kids that are a little more challenging up front, maybe more in-your-face kids, kind of helps.
I deal better with them sometimes than just the average kid, because
Oh,
I
yeah.
have so much more experience on handling
Yeah.
those type of kids, and their problems and their backgrounds and where they've grown up and what they have and don't have.
Mhm.
Those are things that you can't read in a book, you can't pick up. You just got to experience, and I've experienced in 2 different states. So it's every kid has a problem, and sometimes they're similar, just in a different location. And they got a background, they got a history. So those are things that I feel more comfortable, almost around those kids, to be honest with you.
It's a good base to have.
It is.
Yeah. So, well, thanks. I appreciate it.
No problem.
So,
Enjoyed visiting with you.
All right. Well, thanks, Lance.